I think it's easy to forget that springs are ecosystems. They are the whole home for a diverse variety of animals and plants. And the speakers before me gave you some glimpses of little parts of those ecosystems, very important parts. And the job of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the water management districts in establishing BMAPs and TMDLs is to keep our water bodies from being impaired. The idea is to ensure you protect the whole ecosystem. And that has really fallen by the wayside for the most part. Volusia Blue Springs MFL was a very important landmark. I think Dan Bryan is somewhere here in the room. He had a lot to do with it. It was based on manatee protection, and it's the only MFL that really is a long-term restoration plan, a 25-year restoration plan to get up to historic flows. And the district, in the wholehearted excitement of the moment, agreed to do a 25-year monitoring study to look at that recovery over time, because they were expecting the flows to go up because they were telling everybody in Volusia County they're going to have to pump less. Well, we saw the evidence that they're not going up, and it's not surprising based on what's going on with development in that area. And we're also seeing evidence that this is affecting other things besides manatees, and maybe affecting other things negatively. But the problem is we don't have these types of data anywhere else. They started out real strong on this study. They cut it way back, actually stopped it for a while. They're trying to limp along with it now, and I'm really glad that Stetson is getting to do some of the research there. But the work that I was doing there and others, we had a large team of people doing work there. Most of that is, a lot of it's come to a stop. And I hope the district will fund that more in the future and get back to their original commitment for that system. And this, my little talk is just your little glimpse into the ecosystem, what's being done. What's happening is, since the agencies, that's Silver Springs in the 50s, since the agencies have stopped funding this type of research through, it was mostly the Springs Initiative, the Florida Springs Initiative that we'll be talking about later. Dana Bryan and I'll be talking about this afternoon. They were funding all sorts of ecological research, including that 50-year retrospective study of Silver Springs. There's Dana now, he's outside, you can hear me talk about it. But the Springs Institute, that's why we started the Springs Institute, is to fill the gap that's occurring with the state's drop-off in funding for basic science in springs. Now that's changing some. We're studying the hell out of Silver Springs now. $3 million was more than the Springs Initiative got in a whole year. Is being spent on Silver Springs, but really not anywhere else. And we have a whole bunch of springs that aren't being monitored. So the Springs Institute has been trying to pick that up. And we operate on a shoestring budget, no money at all from the state. But we're doing it, and so we're comparing springs. And what you see up there are some of the comparisons. We just produced 3 baseline springs reports this last week. They'll be on our website next week. One for the Ocala River, one for the Chutney River, one for the Rainbow River, that are finding out some pretty interesting things. And they're comparing these systems to the larger database that exists through research previously paid for by the state, but more and more having to be done by universities and volunteers who are basically spending their own time doing it. What we're finding out is there's quite a diversity in the habitat value of springs. We're finding out that habitat value changes over time. Silver, like I said this morning, has the longest record, and we see a decline in the overall ecosystem properties of Silver Springs over the last 50 years of research. I think we're seeing some of that in blue. The long-term record in blue is it used to be vegetated. There's no vegetation anymore. It used to have dissolved oxygen in it. Lots and lots of fish. The dissolved oxygen in blue is almost at 0 at the spring vet during our detailed studies out there. 0. There was no oxygen at night. The only oxygen occurred during the day from the algae that were resistant to those really toxic conditions to wildlife. It was surprising there were any fish in blue, but they could exist down in the lower part of the river. But anyway, we're getting some data. We can go to the next slide if you did that. And not only do you want to study the structure of a system, the structure is the number of fish, the number of manatees, the number of turtles. That's the structure, the number of plants, the biomass of plants. You got to study the function of these systems. It's actually the function that is the most interesting and important part of spring ecosystems and ecosystems in general. So we do that in springs. There's a magical way of studying them by looking at oxygen changes, measuring oxygen upstream and downstream. You can actually come up with how much total plant productivity is occurring in the springs, how much total respiratory metabolism is occurring in the springs, what their efficiency is of converting sunlight into power, which the power is basically the food. Remember, these springs and the animals that live in these springs can't go to Publix to get food. We are totally spoiled as a species because we can go out and get food anytime we want it. All we need is a little bit of this currency stuff, and we can go get it. These animals have to live on the productivity of the ecosystems they live in. And so this whole productivity, the way the whole system works, is just a magical thing that Dr. Odom invented. But anyway, we're comparing the springs and that, and we're finding there's quite a range of health in these springs just based on their overall productivity. And what we're finding some really interesting properties. One is, as Dr. Worf was saying, the discharge is an extremely important variable in springs. You cannot set a discharge standard for springs, a minimum flow level for springs, without considering the ecology of the system. Mostly what's being done in existing MFL determinations is looking at floodplain response, which has almost nothing to do with the springs, and it has to do with a few species of fish, not the whole system. So you might pick a fish as a representative species because you have some data for it, but it may have nothing to do with everything else living in the spring. You've got to study the whole ecosystem. We're seeing that the efficiency of the whole system is dependent on flow. And I have to say the Southwest Florida Water Management District is indeed taking that into account. So not only do you need to look at the functioning systems, you need to look at the historic trends. This is the manatee trend graph you've already seen for Volusia Blue. And you can see the calendar year is laid out there, all these years wrapped into one. You see the manatees are obviously there during the winter, and that's also when people are there watching them. So what we need in Florida, and what we need as part of our overall restoration plan that we're coming out with from this summit, is a new effort for monitoring, whole system monitoring for our Florida springs. These springs are generating probably $1 billion a year at direct economic return for free. We're not doing anything to make them run. What we're doing is making them run less, but for free, we're getting $1 billion of economic value from these springs, as we'll hear later. And we're not putting, we're putting $50 million in now to restore these springs. But as somebody said, it'll take $1 trillion to restore these springs if we do it without looking at the sources of the problem. So we'll be calling for a very detailed monitoring plan that includes all these types of things in the future. If we have another symposium like this in the future and we're successful, then we'll have a much longer science section. Thank you.